Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Stir Trek. Hopefully you've already seen some great sessions this morning, and I'm going to continue following that trend for you all. My name's Presley, and if you're in the right room, you are here to learn about how do we start a new role, this idea of an engineer's playbook. So a little bit about me. I am the owner of a company called Small Batch Solutions. What do? We help put projects back on track. So if you've ever worked on a project that's really went off the rails, you've ever worked with a team where you're like, there's some process improvement we can do. That's exactly what we do. I can help you out. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. Oh. It's hard to hear you. It's hard to hear me? Yeah. Oh my goodness, Dale, can we help out? Thank you, sir, for the waving of the arms. The lights do make it a little bit tricky, so I appreciate it. I don't think anyone's ever told me I've been quiet.
There's an echo.
Oh, yeah. Welcome to the cool thing about theaters. The echo is really great when we're watching a movie, not so much during presentation. That's okay. Dale, it seems like we did bump up the volume. Sounding a little bit better now. Perfect. All right, cool. So I own a company called Small Batch Solutions. Are you working on a project that sucks? Hey, let's help you get it back on track. I'm also a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. What does that mean? It means I do a lot of time talking to people about tech, but weirdly enough, not here. That's okay. Last but not least, I'm an amateur woodworker. That's the first project I ever built. It sucks. It's awful. It has wheels and it is somewhat level, but I made so many mistakes. Why am I showing you all this? This is dumb, right? I show you this because as you start new things, you're going to fail, struggle, and mess up a lot. I tell the same thing to the Cub Scouts I work with. So embrace the suck. Get used to that. But let's go into story mode. Congratulations. You have gotten a new job, and especially in this economy, that's even more impressive, right? So you're celebrating, right? Fireworks showing off, maybe you're sipping some champagne, and then you start. And you get this feeling, right? You're getting bombarded with so much information, and you swear it's conflicting. You swear you were told one thing, but that's not really what happens, and you end up in this Escher-style staircase setup. And then, as one of the gentlemen mentioned earlier, as you kind of get used to it, your head starts swimming, and it is the proverbial, haha, we're drinking from the fire hose that we all joke about, right? My goal for today is to give you a series of steps that you can use to actually formulate and survive, right? I mentioned earlier that engineers typically change jobs every 2 to 3 years. Assuming that your career is about 30 years, plus or minus a little bit, that means you'd be changing jobs 10 to 15 times. It seems kind of dumb that we don't have a process or standard for that. So I'm going to give you some tips and tricks I found to be super helpful. Not only starting a new job, but this is also for starting new projects, transferring in the same company, yeah. So first thing we got to talk about is what does success look like, right? Because we want to be successful. So for me, success looks like, are we fitting in with your team, right? If you go into work and you feel like you're working with a bunch of strangers and you don't like any of them, this isn't going to work, right? You spend a lot of time with these people, and if you hate them, it's not going to be successful. Do you feel like you can do best work? There have been tons of studies shown. In fact, Gallup poll does a great one about job satisfaction. And one of their leading indicators of whether someone's going to be successful in that job is if they feel like they can do their best work. So if you feel like you can go to work but only can do like half of what you like to do, it's probably not going to look great. And then, are you able to work solo? Can you actually own something? Do you have autonomy? Do you have mastery? If you don't, if you always feel like you're being micromanaged or nitpicky, or you need to go through 30 million hoops just to deploy a text change to prod, it's not going to be successful, right? So I usually say working solo, and a lot of people go like, but Cameron, I work in a team. That's okay. When I'm talking about working solo, I'm really talking about that you can own a story or a feature independently, right? You can still reach out to people to ask questions, but you actually have the tools, knowledge, and skills to figure out how to do these things. So for example, maybe you don't know how to do the database script, but you know someone on your team who does, so you can talk to them. That type of thing. So how do we get here? I mentioned 4 pillars. First pillar, guess what? You were hired to solve a problem. What are we trying to do here? What is that problem? What's our tech stack? What tools are we using to solve this problem? Then we have the process, right? How do we work together as a group to solve the problem in question, right? And then last but not least, who am I working with? Am I working as a team of a couple engineers? Am I working on a large team, small team, all of that stuff? That's what we're going to be tackling today. The problem is that's a lot of stuff, and it's not reasonable for you all to become experts in that. So we're going to provide build the foundation and then keep building on top of it. But before we can do that, there's a couple of prereqs that you need to have in mind. The first one is you need a note-taking system of some sort. I do not care what it is. I do not care how you use it, but you do need one. And here's why. So humans, our minds, we're really great at problem solving. And if you went into software development or software engineering, you probably like solving problems too. Otherwise, what are you doing in this field, right? But there's a small problem. We're really good at problem solving. We're not so great at memorization. And studies have shown, in fact, that when you're actually stressed, your memorization gets worse, almost as if you just started a new job, right? So you're not going to be able to retain all this information off the top of the dome, not when you start out. You're going to need some way to take notes. For me, I use a tool called Obsidian. I love Obsidian because it's a markdown. It's markdown files. That means I can check it into source control. That means I can actually have it pushed to GitHub or wherever I'm storing my code at any time. In fact, I actually have that on scheduled job. But you can use tools like Evernote, OneNote, NoteJoy. I think Microsoft has Loop. There's tons of things out there. You can do physical journaling. I know some teams that do that. But for me, the big things are, can I find the notes easily and am I going to use it? Kind of already talked about that, but I don't care about the format as long as you can find the info easily. I used to be a big paper note taker until I had to find something, and woe was me. Because I essentially had like a telephone I was flipping through. It was awful. Telephone book. The other fun thing you're going to need is you're going to need some type of task tracking system, right? And you may be telling me, oh, hey Cameron, but we use Jira or we use like sticky notes on a board. That's cool, that's great. Guess what? Your team is probably using that for dev work. You're going to get a whole bunch of non-development work. Things like, oh, I need to remember to put that time off request, or I got to take that mandatory training. That doesn't show up on Kanban boards. That doesn't show up in Jira, but guess what? It's things that you still need to do. It's things like, oh, I need to follow up with Alice about her question of some UI automation. I need to follow up with Bill about some weirdness I'm seeing in our logs. That's not dev work, but you still got to keep track of it somehow. So at the end of the day, you really need a system that helps you know what tasks need to be done, what's their priority, and essentially know when that task has been completed. Tons of different ways of doing this. I actually recommend this book. Please don't buy it. It sounds weird I'm recommending a book and telling you not to buy it. Borrow this from a library. This is a very short read, but getting things done. In this book, David Allen talks about using an accordion file folder for this approach. But the technique is pretty solid because it gives you a general way of capturing work, prioritizing it, and marking things done. You can read this book easily in the afternoon and start implementing things. So the barrier to entry is very low. With this process in mind, I actually use a tool called Trello. I love using Trello because it's on my phone. So maybe I'm standing in line at a store, doing something like that. I can actually pull it out and put it in there. It syncs. It's also part of the Atlassian suite of products. So if your companies are using Jira or Confluence, you probably have access to Trello already. Some things to keep in mind. Once again, I do not care. There's tons of other tools, Pivotal Tracker, Asana, Kanban Flow, Azure DevOps, GitHub projects. Literally do not care, as long as it's something that you'll use and keep track of. The last thing you're going to need is wonder, right? I mentioned earlier, if you get into the roles because you like solving problems, it's because you're naturally curious about things. So there's an old joke in sales that your ABCs is that you should always be closing. I propose a slight twist to that for engineering, where we should always be curious. We got to figure out, why does it work that way? How does this happen? How do you know that's a thing? Those types of stuff. And the rule here is make sure you're asking at least 3 questions a day, especially if you're starting out, because if you can't ask the dumb questions when you're starting, when can you ask them? This is literally your time. You should be doing that. Not only does this help you check your understanding, this also will help you build your confidence. When I lead teams, this is one of the metrics I'm actually keeping track of. Like, is that person asking questions? And if they're not asking a ton of questions, I may hey, are you following all this stuff? Because I want them to feel comfortable asking those questions. All right, so we've talked about the prerequisites. Let's get into the tools. Right, so let's talk about understanding the problem. What in the world are we trying to do? I hate to tell you this, the company does not care if you ever write code. That's not what they hired you to do. I know that sounds odd because it's in the job description, right? It says you must contribute code, you must do automated testing, da, 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 da. They literally don't care. You are actually brought on to solve a problem, and the company does not care how you solve that problem for the most part. If you don't know the problem you're solving, you are going to fail. Hard stop. The fun thing about these problems, though, especially for engineers, is that this problem is typically complex and has a bunch of fun terminology that like makes zero sense outside of this context. For those with a little bit more experience in software engineering, you might know this as a problem domain. But we got to figure this stuff out, right? So if you're not familiar with the idea of domain, let's talk about some possible ones that I've worked in my career. So for example, I've worked at a company that focused on the wholesale mortgage industry, right? And so their problem was we were trying to help our partners close their loans quickly, because the more loans we can close, the more money we make, the more people we help. I also worked for a company that did SQL Server database performance monitoring. So hey, if you're struggling with that, let me know. I can help you out. But the problem that we were solving for them is, hey, we have database admins who didn't know that their servers were having performance issues until their customers complained. If you're a developer, you know that when customers are complaining, this is the worst case scenario, right? So we actually built tools to help them out with that. And then another problem domain I've worked on is we help solve this problem where these project planners would be managing these really long projects. And when I say a long project, you might think a couple of years. How about 70 years? Yeah, and then they want to know that stuff at the month level. And you're thinking, you're insane. And I'm thinking, this is government work, right? So these are all problem domains, but notice how none of these are tech specific, right? So I'm going to focus on the one highlighted in red, this database performance monitoring one. So you know you've identified the problem if you can answer three questions. Who are we helping? What are we doing to help? And why do they care? So here's the problem statement. Who are we helping? We're helping database administrators. That's our target audience. That's our user base. That's our customers. What are we doing to help? We're helping them discover their performance problems. Okay, cool, we're doing the thing, but why should they care? Yeah, we don't want them to lose money. It may sound like common sense, but I can't tell you how many times I've worked at a job and people didn't know this for like 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. And to me, this is table stakes, right? Then let's combine that. Why do they need our software, right? We were told, I know I said we're not here to write code, but we're going to write some code. Why do they need our software? Sometimes it's because trying to do this manually is painful, right? I have experience in healthcare. Paper charting is a real pain. So doing that manually is not fun. It's also cheaper to outsource that, right? Remember I said people are really good at problem solving, not great for memorization. So why am I asking them to put stuff like in notebooks if we can store it in a database instead? Besides, storage is cheap compared to people's. And then there are sometimes regulatory reasons, like, hey, we have to have a system. We have to have this thing to make this work. We run into that a little bit more in government work. But once you actually understand all of this, you actually start getting inkling of why you're here and what you're trying to do. So I have this kind of quote here, but learning who uses the software, what we do to help, and why they care are fundamental engineering. So I'm going to leave technology for a moment and still stick in engineering. Let's say someone comes up to me and says, Cameron, I need a house. And I go, great, you need a house. And I ask some questions about like, how many floors do you want? How many bedrooms, baths, and I get all this information. I'm meticulous. I write all the notes. I create all of these user stories and I put them on a chart and a board and I build all of it out. And so I come up with this really great 3-story craftsman style house, right? And they're super excited until they see it and then they go, but Cameron, this is for the beach. I completely missed the problem we were trying to solve. They needed a house, but it needed to be something that works with a beach environment, not the woods, right? And we've already talked about this, but once you understand the problem, you can actually be more effective with your learning and how to solve it. So cool, we're going to be learning about a problem. How do we actually do this effectively? Most domains are pretty complex, and they can take months or years to understand. When I was doing the database performance monitoring thing, my product owner was essentially a solutions engineer at Microsoft once upon a time, and he was still learning the domain, and it was the product he supported, right? So they can be pretty complex. But what you'll find is that there's actually a core amount of knowledge that can handle the majority of the problem. also known as the 80-20 rule. Focus on that core. Once you understand the core of how things are hanging, you can always expand later. Long story short, common workflows, not edge cases. Or another way to think about it, hey, if we're going to be trying to solve a problem, let's not use rocket science here. Let's do basic math. Let's get basic math working. We can always do rocket science later. Domain, you're going to hear terms in a meeting, you have no clue what they mean. That's cool, write it down. Just write it down, take notes. And the cool thing is that now that most of you are probably working virtual or remote in some shape, form, fashion, getting an answer to that question could just be a Teams or a Slack message away. So write it down, ask the question. If the meeting's smaller, feel free to ask it. I encourage my people to do that, but if it's a bigger meeting, don't. And if you don't know how to ask that, just be like this. Hey, sorry for interrupting, but I'm not sure if I know what blank means. Can you explain it? I can't tell you how many other times that you'll ask that question and somebody in the meeting goes, I didn't know that either. But you prompting that kind of helped with that conversation. And then as you're working in that problem, make sure you're using the same terminology, right? For my more experienced engineers, you've probably ran into the problem where the business refers to a thing as this word, but in the code base, it's called something completely different. A really common example I just ran into is at the company I'm helping out with now. They have this concept of a retailer, which is great. But inside the system, it was called a home center. Completely different things, right? So I always had to do the mental mapping. That's annoying. Use the same language here. Cool, so we talked about domain, we talked about the problem. Let's talk about the technology. We gotta solve it somehow, right? So your application is, or whatever you're using, is not just one thing, right? It's not just a database. There's a whole bunch of stuff running around. We call that the tech stack, right? So for example, let's say we have a problem where we need some way for people to enter data, and then that data can be seen by others. Cool, this sounds like a web app, right? Web app with a database, common way to solve this problem. How many ways can you write a web app? Well, we know that we'll need something for the front end, right? The UI layer. We're going to need something that handles these requests, so some type of API and back end. And then we mentioned a database. So we've got 3 parts of the stack. But when we go to implement it, it can be all over the place. For example, I can use Angular and TypeScript for the front end, C# and .NET with ASP for the back end, and have all that data stored in Postgres database. That's one tech stack. I can solve the exact same problem, but instead use React and JavaScript for the front end, Node and just Node.js for the back end, and have all this stored in Mongo. It will still solve the core problem, but I think you'll all agree this is vastly different tech stacks, vastly different skills needed. You kind of need to know what you're running into, though, when you get to the job. In addition to all of this, you might find out that you either own some of the problem or the entire problem, right? You're working at a startup like I've done before, you owned everything. You owned the databases, the infrastructure, the DevOps, all of it. Work at bigger companies, you might only be focusing on one module, one part of the app. Figure out what you and your team own and start learning and understanding that. Try not to expand out too far, too early, otherwise you'll take on too much info and drown. So let's say you're like, all right, cool, Cameron, I understand the module, I understand the problem it's trying to solve. And let's say you already know the language. Like for me, I'm pretty comfortable with .NET and like C# and API and stuff like that. So I'm going to spend my time on figuring out how they're being used at that company, because they always have their own libraries, they have their own processes, they always have their own stuff. So how are they doing it? In the few times where I've had to pick up a new tech stack as I didn't know anything about it at all, I got to figure out both the language, the framework, and how they're using it. So find books, videos, documentation, blog posts help you get started. Those are all decent advice. But honestly, just go build something. Doesn't have to be world-changing, just something to get started with. This is where I'm going to break one of my promises to the audience earlier where I was not going to say a certain word. Actually put hands on keyboard and build it out. Try not to auto-generate, because you need to understand how the plumbing is working. Because when you get asked to support it, you got to understand how it worked, right? So really at this point, we're working on repetitions, right? Just getting comfortable with things. So here's how you'll find yourself leveling up over time. You're going to get some task, and that task is going to suck. And you're going to spend a lot of time coding, and guess what? You're going to break things. You're going to ruin things. You're going to make your QA's life horrible. and you're gonna feel really frustrated. But guess what? All of that is actually giving you experience. As you get that experience, you're gonna build up more confidence just in time to get a new task. And this whole rinse and repeat. Totally normal, totally fine. So we've talked about the problem, we've talked about the tech stack. Let's talk about how we actually solve this problem, like the processes. And you may be thinking, my team doesn't have processes. They do. So we've got code, we've got an idea. How do we get to code? How do we get to people? And no matter if you're a startup or a large enterprise, you've got something. I remember my first job, our process was write code and then SSH to the server and copy the files over. Was it a great process? Oh, absolutely not. I absolutely took down prod. Linux is not forgiving when you run rn versus rm. Really not forgiving there. But now we have more processes in place, that's fine. So here's like the stereotypical software development lifecycle. All sorts of stuff there. I don't really care about the things on the right. We're going to talk a little bit more about things on the left, so that build, testing, and deployment side. So when we talk about development, right, this is what step most people think about. We're writing some code to fix, add new functionality, fix bugs, things like that. Here's a whole bunch of questions you get to ask right off the bat. Things like, okay, we've got source code. How do I get it? How do I build this thing? How do I share my changes with others? And cool, I've got changes. How do I give them to people, right? Like, how do I deploy those? That's all tech stuff. But on the process side, you might be asking questions like, how does work get assigned to me? How do I even know what to work on? How do we know if the work is done? And notice my air quotes there, because companies still get to figure out what does done mean. Sounds really complicated, but here's an example process. Yep, our code's stored in GitHub, so when we start work, we get the latest changes from there. When we're ready, we create a feature branch, commit changes locally, and when that work is done, we create a pull request to merge those changes back into main. Notice that this is not an SOP, right? This isn't like 5 pages of stuff, just a simple paragraph there, right? We've got to talk about testing, right? So how do we actually make sure the stuff that we built's working correctly? From a tech side, this could be things like, how do I run the test suite? What's our naming convention? Do we follow like behavior-driven versus test-driven? And then where do I actually put these tests at? And from a process perspective, it's things like, who's responsible for testing? Who's responsible for writing the test? Do I get to write the test? Do I have a QA team that writes the tests? Let's say one of the tests fails. What happens? Do I get to buy donuts for the team because I failed to build on our continuous integration server? Does that mean something's wrong in production and now everybody's like freaking out? What does that look like? And let's say there's a specific type of testing I need. Who do I speak to? Get to ask all those fun questions, and then some. You'll think of more, I guarantee it. So for an example, it could be things like, hey, our engineers are expected to write unit integration end-to-end test. However, we do have a separate team that does things like performance testing and security testing. And anytime before we release a new feature, we've got to schedule time with them so that they can do their test suite. Is this a great process? Oh, absolutely not. There's waste and bottlenecks all over the place, but it's what they're doing now. Once you understand that, we can always improve, but you gotta understand what it is. Last but not least, let's talk about releases, right? So we've built the code, everyone's happy, it's tested, now we're actually gonna give it to people. So what does that look like? What environments do we have, right? I've worked at companies where your environments was local box and prod, and then I've worked at other companies where there's been like a dev, staging, QA, those type of layers. Let's say I need to make changes to how we deploy code. How does that work? Do I talk to someone? Do I just make code changes? What tools do we use and to deploy, and what tools do we use to monitor? Because if any of those things fail, I need to know so I can do some troubleshooting. Who can deploy code to an environment? Can I deploy to prod, or do I need to talk to someone about that? Who makes the decision to deploy? And let's say I need to make a change to an environment. Maybe I need to update the runtime. Can I do that, or do I need to work with someone? All fun stuff that you get to figure out in your first little bit. So in our example that we've been kind of coding through, we have 3 environments: test, beta, and prod. We know that our code gets deployed to test once a PR gets merged in, and then we know that the test environment is for all of our automated tests. And if everything's cool, the engineer can actually put that to beta. Assuming that looks good, product and engineering decide when to push to prod. And to keep our deployments consistent, we use a tool, Circle CI, that allows us to script our builds and deployments. Once again, this is not a massive bit of paperwork, but it gives me enough shape to know, like, okay, here's how things flow through our system. This is a lot, isn't it? right? This is a lot of info to take in, especially if you just started the job. That's okay. Once again, the best advice I can give is like, just chill, right? No one's expecting you to be able to pick it all up on your first day. Ask questions, take some notes, poke on a few things, but honestly, just let the system flow, observe it for a bit, and you'll get more comfortable. So cool, Cameron, I understand how to do dev work, I understand how it gets tested, I understand how to deploy it. How the heck do I know what to work on? Well, guess what? Some companies use some type of methodology to bring it in, break it down, and communicate it out. The trick is, if you know that methodology, you can almost guess everything else that's about to happen. For example, if they're working in Scrum, I guarantee you're going to have something called sprints, and you'll probably have stand-up, and you'll probably have retro. If you're doing Kanban, you're going to hear things about WIP limits, and you're going to hear about cycle time and lead time. And if you're dealing with SAFe, you're just in meetings. You just have more meetings. If you're doing things like waterfall, then you know you're going to have design sessions, that certain things need to happen before you can get to the next phases. If you're doing things like spiral driven, you're going to be doing things like, what's the most riskiest thing I could take on, figure that out, next riskiest, figure that out. I know nothing about your company, but I know if you use one of these, I can almost guess what you're doing. The only difference is like, do we do retros on Fridays at 10 versus every other Fridays at 3? That's really where the differences will be. So, and I already kind of talked, like, let's say if we're doing Scrum, you're probably doing work in some type of cadence, we call it sprints. You're probably taking some time to figure out what we can do for that sprint or for that cadence, we call that planning. We do stand-ups to communicate our updates, and then we've got retros to talk about things we want to change. You may not call all of those things, but you're going to have something very similar. And I kind of alluded to this before, but as time progresses, you'll get used to this process and you'll develop that rhythm. And what's nice is once you get that rhythm, you can actually look at the process and go, this seems a little weird, or like, oh, that's taking a really long time, or why are we doing this? And that actually helps you be more effective, because now you can question what we're doing instead of just blindly following. All right, last pillar, let's talk about people. Who got into software engineering thinking that you didn't have to deal with people? Yeah, and then you find out you deal with people more than ever, right? So I remember my undergrad, I always thought developers worked by themselves, maybe with another developer on pairing, and then I realized like that's not actually true. You're dealing with teams all the time. So common expression here is if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Teams typically are more effective than solo if the teams are effective, but you got to know about your team. Most important person of your team is going to be your manager. You will make or break your experience on how good the manager you have is. So big reason is that you report to them, they help you set your priorities, they can help direct your questions to the right person. And I'm going to tell you a story about one of my first managers I ever had. I'm going to omit their name to protect the innocent there, but I learned a lot of what not to do. I had a manager before that was not the most pleasant to work with. Always critiqued my work, never really gave me constructive feedback, just pretty much would tell me things like, hey, this isn't right. Okay, cool, what's not right about it? It's not right. Thank you, I appreciate that. And it always felt like I was never delivering enough. It got to the point that after 6 months there, I was working 70-hour work weeks, and I still got written up for not getting enough stuff done. I left that company at about a year in. I legit thought I wasn't cut out for software engineering. I thought I just wasted the past 4 years of my life in undergrad, and that was stupid, and I literally could not cut it. I was very lucky that the next job I went to, I got to work with a gentleman named Jeff Mazeroff. Jeff essentially saw, okay, Cameron's had a pretty rough psychological abuse situation, to be pretty honest here. So we paired. He answered all my dumb questions. He answered all my dumb questions the second time. He showed me what does engineering look like, how to ask questions. And I was very blessed because he taught me a lot of my fundamentals that allowed me to actually honestly be on the stage today. This is the power of having a leader that cares and is engaged, and also what can happen if they're not. So for the leaders in the room, this is my call to you. Be engaged with your person. Help them be successful. You're gonna need to build relationships with them, right? So if you've got a new leader, you hopefully met them during the interview. If you didn't, ooh, that's a red flag, right? Because would you blindly sign off on like a house would you buy a house if you never saw it? Probably not. Similar idea here. You're going to want to schedule that intro conversation, usually within your first day or two of being on the job. You need to learn what their expectations are and get to know them a bit. I'm not saying you have to be their best friend. I'm not saying that you have to go get drinks with them after work, but you do need to know at least something about them. Otherwise, you're not really going to see them as a person. You're just going to see them as like a blob. I hate working with boring people, so I love learning about all the weird stuff that people get into. Like one of the guys I'm working with now, he's real big into like historical nonfiction. And so we geek out about like, oh man, isn't it super cool that, if this had happened like 2 weeks later, we wouldn't have had like the movie Cinderella? True story. Right. Talk to me afterwards if you want to know how that weird connection comes through. So for the expectations, I recommend getting a one-on-one schedule on a regular cadence. I'm weird, apparently. I like weekly one-on-ones. Most people look at me like I'm insane because they want 2 weeks, but whatever. You just want it on a cadence of some sort. You should be asking them, how are you, like, hey, I've been here for a couple weeks now. How am I doing? Am I hitting the things that you think I should be? Is there any areas I should be focusing on? If your leader is really good, they're giving you this feedback in real time. They're not waiting for these one-on-ones, but at a minimum, you need to be getting it during your one-on-ones. In addition, we're going to, we talked about this, get to know your leader. What are they like outside of work? Any hobbies or interests? For example, one of my leaders I'm working with now does a lot of golfing. So he's been enjoying the little bit of rain that's been coming through Tennessee. And I already mentioned this before, don't need to be your best friend, but you do need to be friendly. So we've talked about the manager. Let's talk about all the other people you're working with who are super excited that you're here at this company and help them out, right? You're gonna be spending a majority of time with them, so you better understand them as people and understand how to work with them. People are hard. Here's a great example, right? I could come in and ask you all, essentially say, hey, good morning, welcome to Star Trek. And you'll tell me, hey, good morning. I could ask you that same thing 30 minutes later and I might get a different response. Would that not be infuriating as a developer if the code with the same input gave you different outputs randomly at times? So you gotta understand, how do we deal with all that? First thing, who's your mentor? Someone's helping you on board. Hopefully it's not your manager. Not because your manager's not nice, but because you want to kind of share that load off of them. Schedule an intro conversation with them. And then I recommend doing daily sync ups or pairing sessions, something. My life hack is, I'm a very experienced engineer, but when I start a new job, new client, I actually ask one of their newer engineers to walk me through. Not only does it help build up that newer engineer's confidence, but it allows me to kind of get a better idea of how they see the system. Let's see here. We're going to be talking about, once you've got your mentor, you're going to start meeting the other members of your team. Same idea, intro conversations, getting to know them. Sometimes you'll do this in a big mob. That's cool too, if that's possible. I'm a sucker for coffee chats. Even though I work virtually, you can still make that work. So if you're like, oh, but Cameron, I hate small talk. Cool, don't have to do small talk. You can do things like this. What's your role in the team? What's something that you're really good at? What are some things that you could help me with? What's your favorite dinosaur? Doesn't all have to be work related. This is when you find out those who have small kids, because then they'll write off some dinosaur like you've never heard of before. You're like, you've got, right. The parents in the room just chuckle because they know exactly what I'm talking about, right? When your son or daughter, riffs off Diplodocus and you're like, I'm sorry, a what? Or are you a coffee or tea person? All these are fun questions. One of my favorite questions to ask is, what's one thing on the team you know better than anyone else? And then when they say it's a topic that I'm really comfortable with, I'm like, ooh, challenge accepted, right? So we are making friends, we're still building up the team, but the people on the team, it's all over the place. You're probably gonna have one or more software engineers and their experience levels are all over the place. You've got new hires all the way up to people who've been doing this for like 20 years plus, right? You can also have other people. You could have Scrum Masters on your team, which some companies, that's actually a dedicated role. You can have BAs, product owners, testers, support engineers, DevOps engineers, all over the place. In addition to it, you could have really small teams. I personally like teams that are around the 5 to 7 range. I've also worked on teams that were closer to 20. All depends, right? So if you're lucky and you work with people in person, what does that actually look like getting to know them? Make small talk when you bump into them, right? Like, hey Joe, it's been a minute. How are things going? I heard you've been working on that really cool project. What's been interesting about that? If you have their calendar, which is actually a little bit easier to do now than ever, schedule some time with them, right? Take them out for lunch, try to get coffee with them. You'll find that if you actually initiate, most people will typically respond pretty positively on that. Also offer them to pair. Maybe they're super busy, but like, hey, I've always been wanting to work in that part of the code base. Can we pair up? Or, hey, I'm really struggling with this thing. Can you help me with that? All great ways to start building up that rapport. Also, if your company does do team activities, do try to attend those. If you're working virtually, guess what? All this still works. The only difference is you have to be more intentional. There's no more of those chance encounters. So schedule the time. I know people don't want yet another meeting. That's okay. In this case, it'll work, right? My approach for learning about people is I create a whole bunch of questions for us to chat about. And then my goal, if I do the conversation correctly, is that I get them to speak about 2/3 of the time, right? Because I know me. I don't need to know about me more. I need to know a little bit more about them. And then what you'll find is that the other person has the same approach. You'll actually end up speaking about half because the other person is also trying to get you to speak a lot more. If you're not really good at coming up with questions, this is where you could use some tooling that's been talked about at the conference to help you out with some of those. The best piece of advice here, though, is look for open-ended questions. Anything that ends with, like, can be answered with yes, no, maybe, those are terrible questions. Don't do it. I love doing questions of the day, so I'll sometimes throw a question in a chat and just see what it generates. So some of my favorite questions have been, what's your go-to snack? And then you get to see how many people love salty versus sweet versus something just completely off the wall. What's one thing you know better than anyone on the team? Always fun when two people claim they know like 80s rock music the best. If your safety was guaranteed, would you rather explore deep space or the oceans? I'm weird, apparently. I ask this question a lot, and people tell me, oh, I'd love to know space. I'm like, we've got space flight kind of figured, but we still can't figure out how to get to the bottom of the oceans. Just saying there. I actually have a whole list of these types of questions. You can go to questions of the day or to the slide deck and find them. One of my favorite pieces of one of my favorite questions to ask is, it's Halloween time. What's one piece of candy that you wish you could make disappear forever? Tootsie Rolls. Tootsie Rolls are terrible. And I'll take that hot take. I'd rather have candy corn versus Tootsie Rolls. My wife hates me because she loves Tootsie Rolls. That's her favorite. But still, I hate Tootsie Rolls. So at some point, you're going to actually get to know your team and, weirdly enough, build up rapport. Guess what? You're going to start running into people that you keep seeing in meetings. Like, man, we always, like, Jen's in our meetings all the time, but she's not on our team. What's she doing here all the time? And this is when you ask, like, oh yeah, Jen's like our director of engineering, and she's super on top of this project we're working on, so she really wants to know what's going on there. Right, so we just expand. That's all we're doing here. So we can meet with your team lead, and then you start meeting the people on your team. Then you start meeting with maybe people of the different team that you're collaborating with. And then guess what? You're going to ship something to prod that broke. Whoops. Guess what? You get to learn about your support engineer and get to hang out with them for a bit. And one of my other cool pieces of advice I give people is make sure you set up a quarterly skip level with your boss's boss. Great way to figure out things that are happening at a company that maybe your manager's not aware of, and it lets you ask more strategic questions. All of this stuff is all good things to be working on. So we've talked about a whole lot of stuff. What's our actual game plan? So the cool thing is I already made you all a Trello board that you can use right now today. So I'm going to try something risky. I'm going to actually try to use the internet here. See how this works. But hopefully, success. All right, cool. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. But if you were to click on that link, it'll take you to this Trello board where you will clone this board by following the directions here. Once you do that, you have your first week, sprint, month, and quarter's worth of tasks ready to go. So for leaders, you can use this as a template for your team. And this will help you keep track of about darn near everything that you need. All right, now let's see, is this going to do what I hope? Internet worked, cool. Some parting advice. There will always be more work. The reward for getting work done is, guess what? You get more. Pace yourself. This is speaking from somebody who's had burnout twice in their career. You'd figure out how to learn the first time, but pacing yourself. Projects come and go, but relationships last. People over your product, right? I cannot tell you, actually I can. Buddy I work with right now, Justin, I met him and worked alongside him back in 2013. He and I have bumped paths at least 5 times now. I've been his manager, he's been my manager. We've been like peer managers. It's because I never like forced him to be a cog and vice versa that we're still great friends today. Those relationships are important. You're going to be mentally exhausted. You're taking on a whole bunch of information because you're getting new names, phrases, people, processes, commute. I remember it took me about a month to stop going to my old work because I'd go down this highway and I would take a left turn to go to work and now I'm taking a right. I'd take that left for like a month. Super annoying. So give yourself some space here and some grace when you feel like you're going to be just really tired. Do you want to be self-sufficient? Are you tired of asking other people for help? Figure out how they're doing it. For example, hey, Ethan, I'm really struggling on connecting to our database in AWS. Can you help me out? And then, of course, he just does a thing. Ethan, how'd you know that? Oh, it's because it's documented in our wiki. Oh, we've got a section in our wiki that talks about this. I'm just going to keep that for my own use later. And now when this happens again, because I'm going to fall asleep, I don't have to reach out to Ethan. I can just look up my own notes. With that, that does conclude my presentation. If you trust this rando who's been talking to you for the last 45 minutes or so, you can scan that left QR code and it'll take you to everything you've seen today. But maybe you want to chat more, right? Maybe you've got some ideas, maybe you've got some feedback, maybe you're just really interested in getting some help with what you're working on. Scan the QR code on the right. What that'll do is that'll just generate a very basic email that you can send to me. Otherwise, thank you all so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to the rest of Star Trek. Thanks all.